new to this workshop. This is the Living and Working Abroad workshop. We're on the sort of the last day of Career Week, and I want to welcome all of you to this. I also want to extend a warm welcome to Paul Beck. You may have seen him earlier this week downstairs in outside the mailboxes with his wife, representing World Adventure. I am getting it close, getting it right now.
Sorry, I call it World Vision too sometimes. So
gotcha. So Paul Beck, no relation.
But a great last name.
But a great last name. Paul served and his wife served in the Philippines for 25 years. They have a lot of experience, and this is a great opportunity for you to also ask questions. During this, I'm going to try to work and get his PowerPoint working, but I'm going to let him go ahead and start talking. Before we get started, I'm going to open us up in prayer, and then I'm going to turn it over. Lord, thank you for today. I thank you for each of the individuals in this room, and especially Paul and Becky. And I just ask you to be with Paul as he speaks with us today. Open our hearts and our minds to what he has to share. And Lord, I thank you for all our guests today during the Gap Year Fair. And may this just be a time that does honor and glorify you. It's in your name. Amen. So, without further ado.
Oh, okay. Roll over here to the more center now. I don't come as a cultural expert or anthropology major, so I'm not really putting out a disclaimer there. But as John mentioned, I come more with experience, life experience. We lived cross-culturally for over 25 years, and what I would like to share today is some of the observations that we gained in our experiences living in another culture. And once we get the slideshow working, the culture we lived in was a third world country in a tropical climate. So that will be a little bit different maybe than some other cultures. So what I'm going to be sharing is not what all other cultures will be like, but more like what we experienced, and I'll try and do a little review there. The key thing as you go to live cross-culturally, and the thing that we found that gave us success and ability to stay where we were for over 25 years, is to look at the point and say, the difference is, it's not wrong, it's just different. And if you can get that in your head, then that's 90% of the battle in living cross-culturally, and being able to adjust and enjoy what you're doing. And actually enjoy the differences. There are a lot of differences in the culture, priorities and so forth. Enjoy them and don't let them frustrate you. That's the key thing. You know, we have a really good friend, and he, we had been there about 10 years, and when he arrived, and after about the second or third year, he says, "How in the world have you lasted?" He says, "I can't figure out why they do things like they do." And I was like, don't worry about why. You know, they just do it different. You don't have to fix their culture to make it like the culture you grew up in. Just enjoy the differences. And so it's not wrong. You don't need to fix it. It's just going to be different, and enjoy it. Some different examples that you might run into of things that are going to be different. Time. At the etiquette dinner, we were talking a little bit about time in different cultures. And in the culture we were in, time is very relative. We always kind of joked, all right, is this American time or is this Filipino time? You know, when we would talk about starting an event. Because in the Philippines and a lot of other cultures, the time schedule is not important. Here in the U.S., you know, you get a tardy if you come in class late, and you know, end of grammar school, you get a little pin if you were, you know, in class on time every day and so forth. And so there's a lot of emphasis and rewards for being on time, and we're very time conscious here in the U.S. This is great. I'm running out of chairs. I think there's a couple more in the back there.
Just trying to make the point that we're obviously not U.S.
That's right. You're very comfortable. Right. Because in a lot of other cultures, it's not the time, it's the people. People are what's important. And so if we were in this culture and remind your name again? Greg. And if Greg was the important person, I would, well, no, we don't start until Greg gets here. And it's not wrong, it's just different, because people are what's important in a lot of other cultures. So they honor people by waiting things. We were at a wedding. The wedding was supposed to start at 3 o'clock. The wedding started at 4 o'clock because certain relatives hadn't made it there yet. And in Manila, the traffic area, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about traffic, but it's not uncommon to get caught in a half-hour, 45-minute traffic jam and be way delayed and everything running late. So time, it's all relative. You know, weddings, meetings, you know, if you're working in a business, some of the cultures, you know, you just need to realize. We were involved in our, while we were in the Philippines, in the local church, and we were part of the choir. And I shared this story Tuesday with our table at the dinner. But, you know, the choir director who had been in the U.S., he was a Filipino that had been in the U.S., was very much trying to get, okay, this is the time we're going to start. And so to honor that, when he said, okay, rehearsal's going to start at, you know, 10 o'clock in the morning, it's like, okay, I'll get there at 10. But I would learn to bring a book, because I knew we really weren't going to start about 10:30, 11 o'clock. I don't feel the time we want to start. I was involved in a small group with the church. And there was a couple that, you know, we were supposed to start, we started with the meal, and because there were some Americans in there, you know, typical eating time in the Philippines is more 7, 8 o'clock. But, you know, to whatever, since there were Americans, we were going to eat at 6. Hey, am I on? I'm on. All right. So if I click this. Oops, I turned off. There we go. Okay, there we go. All right, we're on time. Okay. They didn't get off work until 6 o'clock. So they were, you know, being at the Bible study by 6 o'clock just was never going to happen. But it never, that didn't frustrate them. You know, in the U.S., it's like, well, I don't get off work till 6. It starts at 6. I can't, you know, I can't be a part of that Bible study. In their culture, they were very comfortable with, you know, hey, we get there when we get there. So time is going to be one thing that is very flexible in some cultures. And again, my wife, and as we were going through this, she goes, you know, don't make it sound negative. The positive thing is that people are important, and that's what they care about, is people. They, you know, many times we get the ugly American syndrome because culturally Americans are very confrontational. We value that. In other words, hey, this is what I feel, and you know, it's important that you know what I'm feeling. Where in other cultures, they call it SIR, smooth interpersonal relationships. It's a very high cultural value. So people and relationships are very high. It's not that, you know, what we do is wrong, and it's not what they do is wrong. Just realize it is different. Another area that you're going to see some things is the social consciousness. In some cultures, they'll have a very limited social conscience. And this will show up in just even in their houses. Many houses where we were at, you'll have a wall surrounding your property. And basically, you know, the house sits and you got a 3 or 4 foot section and then the wall right around it. And in most houses, you get past that wall and it's immaculate. You know, and the houses are immaculate. Even in squatter areas where, you know, they don't have walls, you get inside the house and it's an immaculate house. But if there's a wall around it, you go just past that wall, and that's where they dump all their garbage. Or, you know, in a squatter area, you know, there's all kinds of garbage and messes all right around it. But inside, their social consciousness dictates what's inside their house, not what's on the outside. So, you know, it's very different. Here in the U.S., you're driving down the street and you throw something out your car window, you can get a fine for littering. You know, we have a very broad social consciousness that we want to maintain everything, where in other cultures, it's a very limited social conscience where they're not as concerned about what's outside their property, but they're very concerned about their own personal spaces as well. And that kind of brings me to the next thing. Space and personal space is very important and very key thing. I'm going to pick on you again, Greg. Come here, Greg. We're going to introduce ourselves. Hi, Greg. I'm Paul. Notice in U.S. culture, we meet, we get this length, and that's it. Other cultures, I'm going to be right here with them because personal space is very different. Thank you, Greg. That's a good example there. It's, you know, and it comes up in many ways. In the malls, it'll be very crowded. That's, it's very culturally common in the country that I was in. They would call it pamashao. On weekends, you know, if they weren't working, they'd go to the mall. I didn't buy anything, but that was kind of the meeting place. And so it would be very, you know, you're kind of bumping your way through, especially around Christmas time, you know, then we as Americans avoided it because, you know, there was very, your personal space was very much tightened in on and so forth. So touching, one thing is my wife really enjoyed when her parents came to visit when we first got there. And my mother-in-law probably at this time was late 60s, early 70s, and you know, you get a little slowing down and so forth. It's very culturally acceptable in many places to hold hands. You know, here in the U.S., you see two girls holding hands, and oh, you know, it starts bringing up some flags waving. So, and two guys, and it's definitely. But in other cultures, that's very acceptable. The touching, the personal space, the closeness is very accepted in a lot of other cultures. So again, don't look at it as, oh, how can they do that? That's wrong. Don't they know what that's saying? In their culture, that has no sexual connotation at all. That's just, it's a friend, you know, close and so forth. Walking arm in arm has no implication at all in a lot of cultures. So it's very acceptable to be doing things like that. And space also then will affect driving. And my ministry, main ministry overseas was as a teacher, teaching at a school for missionary kids. So a lot of what I was doing, most of the students were from the U.S. So we were kind of a little U.S. bubble in a way at times, you know, in our ministry, because a lot of it was more U.S. culturally based. I also taught driver education there, teaching for, you know, training students who were going to be coming back to the U.S. so that they could get their license and so forth. And I would tell them in class, I'm going to teach you how we drive here in the U.S. If you ride with me outside of class, I'm going to drive entirely different because I would get killed. You know, driving in some cultures, well, in some countries, you know, they drive on the other side of the road, but in other cultures, again, the space and so forth, you know, you have your lane lines, so you have 2 lanes of traffic, theoretically. In some cultures, you know, you can actually fit 3 cars in 2 lanes of traffic very easily. You know, you learn that you can roll down your window and adjust the guy's mirror next to you, you know, so it's, you're driving in inches. That's all part of that space. You know, they have no problems with closeness and so forth, even in traffic. Part of it's because you're never traveling over 10, 15 miles an hour, either due to the crowdedness of the cars or the road conditions and so forth. So you're not going that fast. So usually if there are little fender bender scrapes, no more than, you know, take a little off or something, you know, usually very little damage done. And the other thing with relative space, if you're in your 2 lanes of traffic going this way, and there's 2 lanes of traffic going that way, well, if something were to happen to jam up traffic for the opposite direction, that means there's no traffic in that lane. Well, that's a wide open traffic lane. So sure enough, I mean, you'll see cars swinging around into the oncoming traffic lane because that's an open space. And that's, you know, it's, again, in their culture, the open space, there's the relativeness, so forth. That, I must admit, I have a hard time saying how in the world, why do they do that? Because then you get 10 lanes of traffic all going this way, having to funnel down into 2 lanes. So, even after 25 years, I was still struggling with that one. But those are all different things where you say it's not wrong, it's just different. And that's the key thing. Anytime you're going cross-culturally, look at it as, it's not wrong, I don't need to fix it, it's just a different way of doing things. So you can get along with that, that's going to help a lot. Before I move on to the next point, any questions on kind of that part of it? Examples? I know we were talking about different examples. You were from in Japan, again, entirely different culture, but time there, their trains, what you say, run by the second. You can say, this train is going to arrive in 15 seconds, and it's going to be there if that's what the schedule says. So time, again, will be relative. It's, I kind of made the comment at first of being an Asian thing, and then realized, yeah, it's true, Japan is, a little bit different. So it's going to vary in different cultures, but again, this is based kind of on my third world tropical culture there. Yeah?
I have a question. So, in Japan, there were some different cultures that were like very based in the Hindu religion.
Yes.
I'm sorry, the
Yeah.
Buddhist religion. And so, is it like that might be a case where like it is like it's socially expected of you to like take off your shoes when you enter the house and whatever. But what if it has like a spiritual root to it?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. It's right or not.
I'll go with an example of what we had and what we dealt with. Being the country that I was in is very Roman Catholic. All Saints Day, what we call Halloween, that's a holiday, a national holiday. And it is expected that you will go to the family gravesite and you'll spend November 1st all day in the cemetery. And you're there to help clean up the grave plot and so forth, and basically just kind of have a family celebration there at the cemetery. Culturally, where it comes from is you're honoring the dead. You'll be praying that they're going to make it out of purgatory. There's a lot of religious background into it. As people will become Christians and realizing, well, you've got to make that decision whether you're following Christ or not before you die. It doesn't matter after you die. You can't do anything to adjust that. But culturally, it was like, we feel like we have to go. Now, we try and share with our family that we're not there to try and get them into heaven. But, so yeah, it's it's a thing of probably not offending, but if it is a morally, yeah, I know what you're saying. So you kind of have to look at it. And there would be some things I would say, yes. Like in their smooth interpersonal relationship thing, they many times have a hard time saying that's a sin. What you're doing is biblically a sin. And so they might tend to gloss over it, where that's where sometimes as American culture it's easier to confront someone and say, what you're doing here in the scripture says is sin. So in those situations, we do maybe look past what their national culture would be, and we would say, hey, it's wrong. And so yeah, in some of those instances, I probably would recommend that you take a stand against it. But again, make sure it's not a cultural difference, but a true religious difference. I guess is my only warning. Any other questions before I move on? Okay, another thing that you'll find living culturally, the pace and speed of life will be very different. Many cultures, the manana mentality, in other words, hey, if it doesn't get done today, I'll get it done tomorrow. And tell your professors that when you have an assignment due, it's like, oh, I got a paper due, well, I'll get it done tomorrow, In this culture, that doesn't fly too well. Many other cultures, that's very acceptable. Again, we were in a tropical climate, tropical culture, where we were happy if we got one thing done a day. Due to traffic, as I mentioned earlier, traffic is usually pretty crazy, and we were just outside the Manila area. The heat, crowds, long lines, where if you're, in a business or especially a government situation, you'd be waiting in long lines. So, if we had to do our visa renewal, that was all we were going to get done that day. After we were usually 4 years overseas and then a year back in the U.S. reporting to our supporting churches and individuals and so forth. And I remember the first time we came back, it was like, wow, it's only 1 o'clock. And I've been to the store, I've communicated with them, I've done 3 or 4 things already, it's only 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I got the rest of, it just blew my mind away how easily we were going to visit a pastor at a church, and it was like, okay, we've got the meetings at 10, and so I was like, all right, we need to allow at least a half hour of traffic and so forth to get there. We got there at like 9:35, and it was like, so what do we do for 25 minutes? So my wife and I sat in the car and just talked for 25 minutes, because we didn't, we hadn't realized how quickly and easily we can get things done here in the U.S., where in other cultures, because of many different things, it's going to be slow. So realize your pace, your speed of life, so forth, things are really going to slow down in many cultures. Be happy if you get one thing done a day. Another key thing, if you can learn the language, that will help you dramatically in understanding the culture. As we learn the Tagalog, the Filipino language, the Tagalog and so forth, we learn more about why they do things the way they do. In the U.S., if I had a glass of water and it spills, or someone, knocked over a glass of water, I could just say, hey, you knocked over the glass of water. Totally culturally unacceptable in the Philippines and in other cultures. And in their language, they reflect that. If that were to happen and they were to say it, they would say, roughly translation, like, it seems that maybe the glass of water was caused to be knocked over. They have all kinds of softeners that they put in the language. And as you learn the language, it's like, oh, okay, that's, you have the parts of speech. There we go. My noun and my verb, and U.S. we threw a few adjectives and adverbs in there, but they've got all these participles, these softeners that they put in there, and so it makes your conversation much longer, but it's much more non-confrontational, which is very reflective of the culture. It's a non-confrontational culture. So learning the language and so forth helps you understand and so forth why the culture is. And I also put folk tales there. It's interesting. There was one missionary, and he was living in a very remote, primitive tribe, and so he was sharing with them the Easter story, about how Jesus had lived and ministered amongst the people, and then, was betrayed by Judas and then taken to the cross. And it totally surprised him afterwards, and, talking to them, they said, wow, that Judas guy's really got his act together. Like Judas was the hero of the Easter story. Because in that culture, in that tribal situation, the betrayal, when Judas came up and gave Jesus the kiss of betrayal, they were clapping and cheering for Judas in that, because that's a value that they had in their culture. It was, kind of back in the headhunting days, and very, like I said, very remote, and so that was a very high part of their culture. It was like, wow, the trickery and so forth in there. So again, learning the culture, learning the folk tales kind of gives you an insight. Oh, wow, okay, maybe that's why, they react in that way. And another culture that I've had interaction with, learning one of their folk tales, they have a folk story about these two birds, and this one bird has built a nest. Well, then the other bird comes along and starts bringing in extra little twigs and extra little things, and starts making, adjustments and improvements to the nest, and pretty soon that other bird owns the nest. And that, to them, that's wow. Look at, that bird really was a smart, great thing, and so different cultures will have different values, and you can kind of learn those values as you learn the language and learn the folk tales. Now, food. I'm going to talk about this, about what you eat and the way to eat. And we've talked a little bit about this. Etiquette dinner this year or last year, any of you have done it? If you haven't done it, highly recommend it. It was a great experience. This is my first year doing it. And it was fun for me, just as we looked at, okay, this is proper etiquette here in the U.S., and I can say, yeah, some other cultures it's going to be different. But what you eat, in many, again, we were in a third world country, drinking water was, you had to be careful. We talk about Montezuma's revenge and so forth. You really, intestinal parasites and so forth. When we first went over, we were warned, don't drink any water, even if you're in the city, be careful, you're better off with bottled water. don't eat any fresh vegetables, you know, just be very careful about anything you eat. Now, after 25 years, I think I kind of developed a cast iron stomach, and I can eat anything and do anything, and it doesn't bother me. But yeah, you really want to be careful when you first get over there about what you eat. Many countries, you know, don't have roadside vendors. You have no idea how that's been prepared or what it went through before it got to their little roadside table things. You know, I'd be a little careful on that when you first get there. You know, when we first got there, we would hear the story. They would talk about the vegetable delivery guys. Vegetables were grown up in the mountain, so as the truck was coming down, you know, it's a little bit warmer, so they want to keep the vegetables looking fresh. So they stop just before they get into the city and just kind of dump them in the little stream running along the side of the road. And, you know, about a half mile up the road, they use the stream as their restroom, you know. So not the cleanest water you want to be washing and rinsing your vegetables in. So, you know, you always rinsed your vegetables after you bought them out of the market, and, you know, you never ate anything fresh and so forth. So you want to be a little careful if you're going into other cultures about what you eat, and, you know, especially avoiding uncooked foods and things like that. Now, the way you eat in the provincial culture where we were, eating with your hands was very common. That was, you know, we call it kamai kamai. And it's basically you get a banana leaf and you pop the rice there, and a little bit of, they call it oolong, but, you know, vegetable or meat or something alongside, and you just kind of mix it together in your hand, and, you know, just ate everything with your hands. And so eating with your hands was very culturally common and acceptable. Now, if you were in the city, you know, as they felt a little more proper, they would eat more like what we eat, like in the etiquette dinner, you know, eating with proper utensils and outside in or anything like that. You know, some Asian cultures, you eat with chopsticks, and so, you know, you're eating in that way. Even, again, we were close enough to the city that, you know, usually eating with utensils was normal, but fork and spoon is all you got. You rarely had a knife. You know, you used your spoon to help cut, and, you know, you just kind of pushed things together and scooped it onto your spoon, and, you know, totally different than the way we were taught at the etiquette dinner, but that was very culturally acceptable. So again, learning and seeing the different ways that you can eat. We talked a little bit about this at the etiquette dinner, and if we were a guest in someone else's home, you know, there was the thing of, you know, if you have allergies and can't eat it, definitely then, you know, pass it by. But as being a good guest and respecting your host, you at least want to take one bite of what they offer you. We kind of had a little saying amongst the missionary community. We said, where he leads me, I will follow. What they feed me, I will swallow. So you at least get one bite down. You don't have to clean your plate the whole thing. Matter of fact, in some cultures, in the culture we were in, you would never clean your plate. That was a sign that they hadn't fed you enough, and you were still hungry. So you would always leave a couple of bites left on your plate, just to say, oh, you know, that signified you fed me more than enough. I can't, you know, I've got so much food that I can't finish it. Christian was at our table Tuesday night, and I guess he had been in the Middle East, and he said, yeah, he said, I got overstuffed sometimes because I mistakenly, you know, I grew up, you cleaned your plate, so I'd clean my plate, you know, they'd come by with more food. It's like, oh, well, Lord, I gotta eat a little bit more. So, you know, as you learn the culture, be aware of, you know, here in the U.S., I know my mother-in-law, if you didn't clean your plate, she was offended because she expected you to love her food so much that you ate it all and, you know, wouldn't want to leave any on your plate. Other cultures, you want to be ready to, you know, leave a little bit on your plate. That signifies that, you know, you fed me enough and I'm done. Another, in kind of the way with food, it's very culturally expected in the culture that I've lived in and worked in, that they would share their food. So, you know, you're coming in, if you're, you know, everyone's bringing a sack lunch, and you would come in and immediately, oh, you know, as you're taking it out of your bag or so forth, oh, do you want some? Do you want to share some? Well, since it's very accepted that you want to share, then on the other hand, you have to realize, okay, if they ask me if I want some, you know, no, that's okay, you know, that's all right. Then if they ask a second time, well, do you want some? Well, no, that's okay. If they ask a third time, then it's acceptable to say yes. Then they're sincere, they really have more than what they want, and they're willing to share. It's kind of interesting, some Filipinos had come to the US, and so they were eating, they had their meal, and the host said, well, would you like seconds? Well, they were still hungry. But it's like, oh, no. They were waiting for the third ask. Well, the hostess, okay, you don't want me? Fine. I said, they were gonna go to McDonald's about 10 o'clock at night because they were still starving, they hadn't had enough. But, so, again, realizing what is culturally acceptable as far as if they offer, more, or if they offer food at all, what is the culturally accepted thing? Learning about the culture and so forth before you even do that. And so food can, a lot of different things in the culture that you can learn about that. Safety issues. In the culture we were in, again, very third world culture, we very rarely felt our physical safety was threatened. That just, again, where people and relationships are very valued. But again, because most of the people were so poor, if they see, oh, you got 4 pairs of shoes, you only wear one pair at a time. I don't have any shoes. There was really nothing culturally wrong to come in and take a pair of shoes, because you don't need them, obviously. That still leaves you 3 pair, which is more than what you need at one time. So we had to be very careful about possessions as far as safety in that way. That was one issue, and again, learning about that. In some cultures, in some areas of the world, you need to learn what areas are unsafe. Now, it's interesting, the Philippines will permanently have a travel advisory from the U.S. government, because in the southern part, in the southern island, there is conflict. Matter of fact, down in that, if you know any of the Philippine history, Magellan came through, discovered them, Spain colonized them, and so forth. They were Spanish colony. The southern island of Mindanao totally resisted the Spanish influence, and they're very proud of it. I mean, you come down there and they're like, no, we were never colonized by Spain. 90% of the other country, of the northern part of the Philippines would consider themselves Roman Catholic, where the southern island is mostly Islam, Muslim. And again, it's that separatist thing. So there's areas down there, because of political situations, that would not be safe to go. Where in Manila, I'm very comfortable in probably about 90% of the places there being able to go and so forth. But because of tensions and so forth within the government and so forth, we are advised from time to time to change our routines, our schedules. Now, there's not a whole lot of roads and options that you have in travel, but every couple months, change your options instead of always going, this way on this road at this time of day. Do it a little bit different time, pick a different road, just vary your schedules from time to time, especially if there's getting close to an election. It's, again, this will sound negative, but it's just the way some of the cultures are. I remember after we were there for the first election, and they said, it was a good, safe election, only 25 people died. Like, wow, normally there can be up to 100 people. Again, election violence and so forth. So, election time, we would learn to kind of change schedules and kind of do things a little bit, so forth. Be aware of your surroundings, and listen to the warnings. The thing, I want to say, in the time that we were there, most of the times where there was any violence or kidnappings and so forth of foreigners was where a warning had been issued, and it was like, well, I think I'm gonna be okay, it'll be safe. And that's usually then, so listen and be aware of the warnings and so forth. So as you go to live cross-culturally, learn what makes the people tick. What makes them hurt, what grieves them, what makes them angry, what makes them celebrate. Interesting, one thing I kind of meant to talk about in the differences, hand gestures. And some of of the gestures that we have very acceptable here in the US can be very offensive in other cultures. You know, in the US, if I do this, I'm saying, okay, yeah. In the Philippine culture, you do that, you're asking for money. That's supposedly the size of the Philippine peso coin, so it's, you know, you're looking for money in that. You know, if you want someone to come, you know, a signal like that, that would be very offensive to a Filipino. That's the way you call a dog. So, you know, you could be a very respected, honorable person, and if I do that, you know, I have committed a very big social. If you want to call a person, you do this. Or, you know, that's calling the dog. So it's, again, hand gestures, you know, learning about what offends them, what, you know, again, what they celebrate. And I guess the key thing is enter into their world, enjoy the differences. You know, it was great after being there so many years and having some friendships and so forth, and, you know, we relate to something. But we were honored, and, you know, they waited for us. It was like, you know, we were respected and honored as people, that we were more important than, they would say, a silly time schedule. And in that culture, you know, so enjoy the differences and enjoy the things there. When you come cross-culturally, come as a learner. Again, don't come with the attitude that I'm gonna fix or I'm gonna change the way they are because it's wrong, because we, you know, I know a better way. But come as a learner, come as willing to adapt and to be part of their culture. Again, learn about as much about the culture before you go. Here in the US, we have, in many large cities, you know, you'll find pockets of different cultures. You might be able to find the culture that you're going to. Go and spend some time in those areas. Learn as much about the culture as you can, so when you get there, you're a little bit better prepared. You know, when you get overseas, we talk about the honeymoon stage as you're going through transition. And, you know, the first time you get there, hey, everything, you know, this is great and so forth. And then after a couple of months, could be weeks, whatever, then it's like, no, this is kind of frustrating that I've got, you know, you get past that honeymoon stage. But if you kind of prepared yourself ahead of time and learned a little bit more about their culture, you'll be able to understand just a little bit more about what they're doing. I've lost track of where we at.
It doesn't matter.
All right, okay. I do have a few more minutes because I did want to leave some more time just for questions. But questions, comments? Again, I'm not a cultural anthropologist expert or anything, but this is just the experiences that I went through in my over 25 years of living in the Philippines. So any questions about different cultures, different things? How many of you have lived cross-culturally, been overseas?
Just been overseas.
I would say live cross-culturally. In other words, you can be overseas and still be in a Western culture, and you know, McDonald's is still in the corner, but you know, but maybe been in a different culture. So experiences you have had, you're going, yeah, these are the same, different. You know, like I said, Tuesday night at the dinner, we realized we were talking time in Japan. You know, there, the flexible time schedule is not quite as much there as it is in other cultures. So yeah, you will see some differences. Questions, comments, anything at all you'd like to share? Sure. I'll start with sensing God's call. Growing up, I saw myself as a teacher, so I went to university to get my teaching degree, fully expecting to be teaching here in the U.S. and being a core teacher and, doing different things with my summers and so forth. My senior year at university, I became more aware of the need for teachers overseas teaching at missionary kids schools. A couple of kids in my dorm were MKs. I'll admit, growing up in the church, and especially the church that I attended, they supported missionaries, but they all seemed to be church planters. So the idea of going overseas as a teacher or in some other ministry other than a church planter just interested. I was actually going to try and do my student teaching overseas at an MK school. That didn't work out, but there was still that awareness of, God might be calling me. So after teaching for a couple of years here in the U.S., I contacted World Venture, who is our mission agency that we've been with for 25 years, and said, my wife and I, we were just getting married, and said, we're interested in teaching overseas. We'll go wherever you want us to go. So we ended up going to the Philippines. Actually went short term. We were going to be there for 1 year, filling in for another missionary who was on home assignment. And then so we were open to overseas, but then at the end of the year, the school said, hey, we've got another teacher who's leaving, would you be willing to stay on? And we said, yeah, this year is confirmed that this is what God has for us. So we stayed on for another year, came back to the U.S. to get appointed and all the training we needed to be career missionaries, and then returned back overseas. So we first went over in 1979, we were there 79 to 81, came back, then were appointed in 1985 after I think it's my theological education completed and so forth with mission. And then we've been there. We came back in 2011 for our planned 1-year home assignment. And then my father-in-law had a stroke in September of 2011. And he's 93 now, so we sensed that God has called us to stay here. So we're here as kind of recruiters for our mission organization. Age, I'm almost 60, so our plan, and we've learned to say it's our plan, because our plan was we were going to be back in the Philippines after, 2012, after our 1 year. But God's plan, and we're just praying that this is also God's plan. But when God calls my father-in-law home, our plan is to head back to the Philippines and be back in ministry there. So while we're here, we're enjoying visiting colleges and sharing and just seeing how God trying to get you guys to come out and pick up some new education majors. I would really like to talk to you. Brad and Thomas. But yeah, that's kind of my background there. So yeah, it's to get a little education plug here. It was just exciting to us to see, how God can use teachers. I grew up saying, missionaries are church planters and so forth, but how he uses people in many different ways. My wife has gotten involved in many different ministries through quilting, and working in ministry with Muslim women, working in ministry in a prison and so forth. And she kind of remembers when she had been introduced to quilting here in the U.S. and said, oh, that's an old thing. Well, then got involved while she was in the Philippines, and friends of hers and so forth built it. She began to enjoy it. And she says she can remember one time sitting there doing some quilting and going, God, this is so much fun. It'd be great if we could use this as a ministry. And within a couple of years, she became known almost as the quilting lady, doing all these different ministries and so forth, going out. And so we love to say God takes who you are, and that's how he uses you in the mission. And so it's just exciting to see how God takes, like I said, who we are, and used me as a teacher to allow other missionaries to do their ministry. And the thing that we've enjoyed the most is the opportunity to work with the students. We've been there long enough that when we first got there was a guy who was in the dorm, and we got to work and kind of mentor and work with him. And then in 2006, his daughter graduated from Baker Academy. So we, were there long enough to work with his daughter, and so we've seen a couple generations, and it's not uncommon for MKs to return to the mission field. So all the new education majors come join us and make an impact in the whole ministry by teaching the kids and being part of their lives. Those of you who are education majors, you're Mr. Beck, and you have to be all that dignified person up front, which I am in the classroom. Outside the classroom, I'm Uncle Paul. And it's just been a great relationship I've had with kids.
And Paul, just to add to that, not only do missionary schools need teachers, they need accountants, they need nurses, they need the whole gamut of the kinds of folks you would need to run a community. So teachers, yes, but others too.
Yeah.
So if you're not an education major, don't just say, well, I couldn't do that.
Oh, yeah.
There could certainly be a place for you.
You've got, yeah. Well, do a little plug, go to our website, worldventure.com/go, and you'll come up with a page, and it will be all kinds of, taking you to all kinds of different opportunities around the world, in all kinds of different ministries. We like to say we're 360-degree mission, because any direction you want to go, we're ready to go with you, and ready to help you go. So, yeah, you see our banner out there, we've got, sports ministries, businesses missions, is really, in the last couple of years, it's really made more of an impact. I remember one guy several years ago came, and he was a church planner. He says, I can plant a church. He says, but if I leave, there's no way the people here have enough money to support a pastor. So then he started doing livelihood projects and so forth, and creating so the families had at least enough financial that, either they could help support the pastor, or the pastor could do this kind of job on the side as well as his thing, so that he has to lead the church and so forth. So, yeah, there's a lot of different, it's not just the Bible people going out as missionaries, it's any and everything that we do. We were in a little Sunday school class, and, we would tell the kids, anything you want to be, you can be overseas. And kid goes, I want to be a veterinarian. I had to think, wow, and I realized, you go to Mongolia, you can't go in as a missionary, but you can go in as a veterinarian. So you're taking your professional skills and using them overseas. So Spring Arbor is giving you a great experience and background and professional training. Take that and use it overseas. Use it cross-culturally. Again, you don't have to do it as a missionary, but going as a business person, going in many different areas. Use the experience that God has given you here to make an impact in other cultures and so forth. Because you have God in you. That, the Awana kids at the church I'm attending, we're doing the fruit of the Spirit. I keep telling them, the Spirit is in you. And the fruit of the Spirit is what should be coming out of you. The love, joy, peace, patience, that whole list and so forth. So you make a difference to people. When that is growing out of you, you'll make an impact. Even if you're there just as an accountant or whatever in a business area. You're not there as a missionary. Use the skills and spread the gospel around the world. I've gone off on a tangent.